Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God. Back with you with the next video in my series, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Great Expectations. I felt that this was a good statement of the case and told him so. Wouldn't say it to anybody but yourself, he answered. I know this I know what it is said between you and me goes no further. I asked him if he had ever seen Miss Havisham's adopted daughter, Mrs. Bentley Drummle. He said no. To avoid being too abrupt, I then spoke of the aged and of Miss Skiffins. He looked rather sly when I mentioned Miss Skiffins, and stopped in the street to blow his nose, with a roll of the head, and a flourish not quite free from latent boastfulness. Wemmick, said I, do you remember telling me before I first went to Mr. Jagger's private house to notice that housekeeper? Did I? He replied. Ah, I dare say I did. Deuce take me, he added, suddenly. I know I did. I find I am not quite unscrewed yet. A wild beast tamed. You called her. And what do you call her? The same. How did Mr. Jaggers tame her, Wemmick? That's his secret. She has been with him many a long year. I wish you would tell me the story. I feel a particular interest in being acquainted with it. You know that what is said between you and me goes no further. Well, Wemmick replied, I don't know her story. That is, I don't know all of it, but what I do know, I'll tell you. We are in our private and personal capacities, of course. Of course. A score or so of years ago, that woman was tried at the Old Bailey for murder, and was acquitted. She was a very handsome young woman, and I believe had some gypsy blood in her. Anyhow, it was hot enough when it was up, as you may suppose. But she was acquitted. Mr. Jaggers was for her, pursued Wemmick, with a look full of meaning, and worked the case in a way quite astonishing. It was a desperate case, and it was comparatively early days with him then, and he worked it to a general admiration. In fact, it may almost be said to have made him. He worked it himself at the police office, day after day for many days, contending even against even a committal, and at the trial, when he couldn't work it himself, sat under counsel, and everyone knew, put in all the salt and pepper. The murdered person was a woman a good 10 years older, very much larger and very much stronger. It was a case of jealousy. They both led tramping lives, and this woman in Gerrard Street here had been married very young, over the broomstick, as we say, to a tramping man, and was a perfect fury in point of jealousy. The murdered woman, more a match for the man, certainly, in point of years, was found dead in a barn near Hounslow Heath. There had been a violent struggle, perhaps a fight. She was bruised and scratched and torn, and had been held by the throat at last and choked. Now, there was no reasonable evidence to implicate any person but this woman, and on the improbabilities of her having been able to do it. Mr. Jaggers principally rested his case, you may be sure, said Wemmick, touching me on the sleeve, that he never dwelt upon the strength of her hands, then, though he sometimes does now. I had told Wemmick of his showing us her wrists that day of the dinner party. Well, sir, Wemmick went on, it happened, don't you see, that this woman was so very artfully dressed from the time of her apprehension, that she looked much slighter than she really was. In particular, her sleeves are always remembered to have been so skilfully contrived that her arms had quite a delicate look. She had only a bruise or two about her, nothing for a tramp, but the backs of her hands were lacerated, and the question was it with fingernails? Now, Mr. Jagger showed that she had struggled through a great lot of brambles, which were not as high as her face, but which she could not have gone through and kept her hands out of. And bits of those brambles were actually found in her skin and put in evidence, as well as the fact that the brambles in question were found on examination to have been broken through, and to have little shreds of her dress and little spots of blood upon them here and there. But the boldest point he made was this: it was attempted to be set up in proof of her jealousy, that she was under strong suspicion of having, at about the time of the murder, frantically destroying her child by this man, some 3 years old, to revenge herself upon him. Mr. Jaggers worked that in this way. We say these are not marks of fingernails, but marks of brambles, and we show you the brambles. You say they are marks of fingernails, and you set up the hypothesis that she destroyed her child. You must accept all consequences of that hypothesis. For anything we know, she may have destroyed her child, and the child, in clinging to her, may have scratched her hands. What then? You are not trying her for the murder of her child. Why don't you? As to this case, if you will have scratches, we say that, for anything we know, you may have accounted for them, assuming for the sake of the argument that you have not invented them. To sum up, sir, said Wemmick, Mr. Jaggers was altogether too many for the jury, and they gave in. Has she been in service ever since? In his service ever since? Yes, but not only that, said Wemmick. She went into his service immediately after her acquittal, tamed as she is now. She has since been taught one thing and another in the way of her duties, but she was tamed from the beginning. Do you remember the sex of the child? Said to have been a girl. You have nothing more to say to me tonight. Nothing. I got your letter and destroyed it. Nothing. We exchanged a cordial good night, and I went home, with new matter for my thoughts, though with no relief from the old. Chapter 49. Putting Miss Havisham's note in my pocket, that it might serve as my credentials for so soon reappearing at Satis house, in case her waywardness should lead her to express any surprise at seeing me. I went down again by the coach next day, but I alighted at the halfway house and breakfasted there, and walked the rest of the distance, for I sought to get into the town quietly by the unfrequented ways, and to leave it in the same manner. The best light of the day was gone, and I passed along the quiet, echoing courts behind the high street, the nooks of ruin where the old monks had once had their refectories and gardens, and where the strong walls were now pressed into the service of humble sheds and stables, were almost as silent as the old monks in their graves. The cathedral chimes had at once a sadder and a more remote sound to me, as I hurried on avoiding observation, than they had ever had before. So, the swell of the old organ was borne to my ears like funeral music, and the rooks, as they hovered over the grey tower, and swung in the bare high trees of the priory garden, seemed to call to me that the place was changed, and that Estella was gone out of it forever. An elderly woman whom I had seen before as one of the servants who lived in the supplementary house across the back courtyard opened the gate. The lighted candle stood in the dark passage within. As of old, I took it up and descended the staircase alone. Miss Havisham was not in her own room, but was in the larger room across the landing, looking in at the door. After knocking in vain, I saw her sitting on the hearth in a ragged chair, close before, and lost in the contemplation of the ashy fire. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, so it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care. Thanks again.